Good morning, Dan and Amy. Well, the saga continues in Springfield, and it's good that it did. It's good that we have no state budget.
Again.
For this reason. Because any budget that Madigan would sign off on would have been impossible for Ronner to sign off on. Because all the Democrats want to do, as the Democrats in the Senate proved, and as we talked about last week, is raise taxes to put off the oblivion, the financial oblivion of the state for 1 day longer, for 1 month longer. No spending reforms, nothing on the spend side, which is why it's interesting, based on the polling that we talked about last week, there is such opposition to tax increases, even from people who say, look, I'm willing to pay a little bit more in theory. The reason I'm not willing to pay a little bit more to the state is because I don't believe that the elected officials in state government are going to spend the money how they promised to spend the money. They're not going to fix any problems with it because we've seen this over and over and over again, and I'm starting to catch on. Number one, I can't afford any bigger of a burden. Number two, to the extent that I can, if it was to pay down bills to social service providers, if it was to do other things that I think state government should do, then maybe I'd be more amenable to it. But since I've witnessed everything that's been done as we have borrowed and spent and taxed and spent over the last 40 years, to Illinois being the worst governed state in the nation, the state that will be the first state to have a junk-rated credit rating in the history of our country. That's how badly financially mismanaged the state is. I'm just not on board.
I'm still trying to process the $14.5 billion in unpaid bills.
Right.
I mean, that is
with annual revenues of $33 billion. That tells you how big that number is. And remember, this isn't the last 2 years without a constitutionally balanced budget. That is a misreporting by the Chicago and Springfield press corps. It is 2 decades. How do we run up a quarter of $1 trillion in debt, which is what Illinois has? The largest unfunded pension liabilities in the country, which is what Illinois has. You think this just all started in 2015 when Ronner was inaugurated? I know that's what Madigan and Cullerton and the Democrats want you to believe. It just turns out not to be true. That's the problem. But meanwhile, the General Assembly did accomplish a couple of things. We got that truth and catfish labeling legislation.
Oh, thank goodness. I was so concerned.
We also got transgender birth certificates. That's going to the governor's desk. So the social engineering continues. And by the way,
Is the governor going to sign that?
I don't know what he's going to do. And that in the House, that was with the support of some erstwhile conservative Republicans like David Olson out of Downers Grove. Just a horrible judgment call on his part. By the way, that's somebody that I've supported through my PAC. So I have some standing, I think, to talk about this in addition to just the standing as an Illinois resident to talk about it. And then there's this, which we've talked about as well, Amy, on the show. School funding. So remember all the Andy Minar, they embroiled me in this as well. The school funding, changing the formula to make it more equitable, to help out school districts that are low property tax school districts, to help out children who need more resources devoted to them because they're from areas where you don't have a lot of intact families, frankly. I know we describe these areas as poor, but the real problem is the intact family. And so the Democrats cooked up this new funding formula and then lied about it and lied about it and lied about it. And then they passed Senate Bill 1, which passed on a straight party line vote, basically a party line vote, that would send $400 million more a year to CPS, as well as take the responsibility for funding CPS's underfunded teacher pension fund. So how is that recalibrating? It's just a bailout of CPS. That's all it turned out to be, because that's actually all that Chicago Democrats are interested in. And then you got to sprinkle some money downstate in particular Democrat areas to cobble together the necessary votes. Interestingly, you have a ton of suburban legislators, Democrats, who voted for this, whose schools, if this would ever be enacted, which it won't be, whose schools would be dead bang losers. people who feign independence from the Chicago Democrat bosses, like Scott Drury up in Lake Forest. He voted for it. Hack. Liar. Crespo up Hoffman Estates Way. Deb Conroy in Eastern DuPage. Mike Halpin, newly minted legislator down in the Quad Cities. Robin Gable up in Evanston. Stephanie Kifowit out in Aurora. Michelle Manley out in Bolingbrook. Elaine Nekritz out in Northbrook. Carol Sente up in Lake County. And interestingly, Marty Moylan, who's out Park Ridge, Des Plaines Way, he voted for it. And yet he has a petition on his website asking his constituents to join him in opposing it, which he suggests will lead to local school funding cuts, which is what I said would happen. So this is the two-step they play on their own constituents because they believe, and so far, I mean, there's some evidence to suggest they're right, that not enough of their constituents can connect the dots between them, I'm talking about suburban Democrat legislators, and their boss, Mike Madigan, who take their marching orders from, and that they can get away with, on the one hand, opposing it, trying to be a protector for our schools, and on the other hand, actually voting for it. And you wonder why we're the worst governed state in the nation. And part of it has to do with the fact that people like Marty Moylan are getting away with it. Well, for more on this topic and the straight dope, we're happy to have again on the show State Representative Jeanne Ives, Republican from Wheaton, who is, frankly, the most honest legislator in Springfield and the most studied. She knows this stuff backwards and forwards, which is why she's our go-to person in the General Assembly. Jeanne, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on, Dan. This is important.
So the lack of a budget. Now, looking forward, because this is where we're at. I know Madigan's talking about budget hearings and doing those Potemkin hearings he likes to do. But starting July 1, the new fiscal year, and with a look ahead, you're talking about some real seizing up of the system that's being predicted. More job cuts at universities, perhaps some universities like Chicago State closing. You're talking about questions about whether K through 12 schools around the state will open because there's no continuing approach for K-12. Talking about more consolidation or elimination of social service providers from the landscape for persons who need the services they provide. You're talking about some serious consequences. So what are we to do with those those additional serious consequences beyond what we're already bearing right around the corner?
Well, I mean, at this point, I don't know what to do. I mean, we're going to be a junk-rated state. We deserve to be a junk-rated state. There's no doubt about that. And but this is all set up by design. You know, so Mike Madigan will jerk us around all day long for 5 months. In fact, I don't think I've been this jerked around since I was a plebe at West Point. And, you know, this is exactly what he wants to do. They don't care about policy. It's all pretend to them. Any bill that they discuss on business, it's as if those policy decisions have no impact in the real world. So let's talk about a $15 minimum wage. Let's talk about a worker compensation bill that every single business opposes and pretend that that's real. So they shouldn't get a pass. I mean, if you want to know where we're headed, the only place that we're going to be headed is, further people leaving the state, further businesses leaving the state. And the only solution really is a political solution. You can't believe the Democrats and what they're telling you down there. You can't believe a single one of them. You have to vote them all out of office. That's it.
So now you'll wait a few months and then hit this again in the month of June, or later this month, I should say, because it is June 1st today.
Well, as far as I'm told, we're going to be down there at the end of June. I was even told even more specifically, probably he'll do some budget hearings, maybe the third week of June, and then the last week of June, just before June 30th. Apparently we'll be down there for 1 or 2 days to vote on bills and see what happens there.
The reality, though,
I think this is headed to a stopgap, but whatever.
Okay, so you think it's headed to a stopgap, but the reality is whether it's a stopgap or it's just funding based on court decrees, we're looking at 2018. Going back to what you said, that there's only a political solution to this. This effectively is going to 2018 and will be determined, these issues that were batted around in this past session, tax increases or or spending reforms and structural reforms of state government or some combination of all of the above, that will be decided by who is victorious in November of 2018, both for governor as well as who's in control of the General Assembly. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly right. But you've got some big constituencies that are competing for the messaging at the local level. And there's no bigger constituency competing for that message than, I would say, big government education. And that's what you saw with Senate Bill 1. So, terrible bill, massively bails out Chicago, gives other people just peanuts on any just new revenue. And all your superintendents, for the most part, were all in on this. Why? Because they were assured to get as much money this next year and in years in the future, in perpetuity, than they got in fiscal year 17. So they're just grabbing for scraps. And so you're going to have this big conflict as to who's going to win the messaging more. Is, hey, you know what, the Democrats are looking out for us or the Republicans are looking out for us. And that's the problem. People don't even understand these issues, and that's by design, too. They're too complicated. And so folks got to pay attention.
It's funny because on the school funding formula, Andy Minar, who's been the lead dog on this, Democrat state senator from Decatur, talked previously over the years as he's been continuing to push this redistribution formula that gives more money to Chicago in particular. He talks about the school funding formula needing to be more transparent and simplify so that people can understand it. And of course, it's the opposite, because if it's unknowable, then you don't have the rule of law, and then it's just a messaging campaign. There's no law to point to that is discernible.
Well, that's true. Yeah. And if people want to think that this is a new funding formula and we had to change it, the truth is 90% of the money for next year will be spent in the old way and keep Chicago at an advantage. In fact, it gives them an even bigger advantage. So I'm happy to have a discussion about this in my district and tell everybody what's going on, but everybody has to have this discussion. And I will tell you, if you've been represented by a Democrat for 10 years, decades in some cases, you don't know what's going on because they're not telling you the truth. You're not getting real data. And that's what's so regrettable about these. People are buying into the rhetoric without understanding. For example, everybody knows that we have a budget crisis, right? $14.5 billion in back bills. Right now, they want to spend $5 billion more than we take in. They want a massive tax increase. None of that matters because this week alone, they were wanting to spend $2 billion more through certain bills when we haven't even solved the problem before. They don't care about taxpayers.
And it's real simple. I hear this question all the time. How do we get rid of Madigan? 9 seats. You got the Republicans have to net pick up 9 seats in 2018. That's how you get rid of Madigan. So if you've got a suburban Democrat legislator in Park Ridge or Eastern DuPage or Lake County, it's you. It's your decision whether we continue under Madigan or not. Simple as that. State Representative Jeanne Ives, Republican from Wheaton. Thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it, Jeanne.
Thank you for having me.
And she joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.